Hi, and welcome to the video course for the Azure Administrator. This is mapping to the AZ-104 certification exam. My name is Patrick Lohner, and I'll be your instructor on this course. I want to start just with a little bit on my background. I've been in the IT industry for a little over 20 years. Worked as a Microsoft certified trainer and a network and facilities administrator for about 7 of those years, from 2000 to 2007. I got my first MCSE on Windows NT, and I've gotten an MCSE and MCSA on basically every Windows version since. Lots of certifications on client exams, certifications on Exchange, now on Azure, Office 365, etc. From 2007 to 2018, I worked as an independent consultant, contract trainer, as well as doing a lot of migrations with Exchange on-prem, as well as Exchange to Office 365. And then in 2018, I went to work for a large regional MSP based out of Minnesota. And my job really on a daily basis includes project work, and it is predominantly moving organizations to the Azure cloud, moving email systems to Microsoft 365, moving file share data to SharePoint and Teams data sites, and going through that implementation. As an MSP, we offer IT support and services to other organizations. The beauty of that, though, is in 3 years of doing that, I've dealt with organizations of all different sizes, all different types, different data storage needs and whatnot. And so just been able to see a lot of things. I've been working with Azure for a number of years now and have, taken and passed this and other certification exams. So that's a little bit about me. How about the course? Well, this is designed to help you prepare for and pass the AZ-104 Azure Administrator exam. That is a single exam, a single certification. We're going to start with Azure Identity Management Solutions. We're going to talk about Azure AD. What is its function within an Office 365 tenant, within Azure? How do all these things relate to one another? How do we create and manage users and groups and the like? We'll look at the different Azure management tools and processes. So the Azure Management Portal, the PowerShell snap-ins, the cloud-based shell, and other applications. We'll talk about Azure Storage, what it's used for. We can use it for file shares. We can use it for blob storage, for backups. We can use it for a number of different things. We'll go through all the different types, how to set it up, how to secure it. We'll look at Azure networking. Obviously, that's a very big piece. How do we create virtual networks and virtual subnet, placing virtual machines on those locations? How do we set up routing between VNets? Or how about a VPN to an on-premises environment? We'll be going through all of that, including talking about how to secure that network traffic. The next chapter will be Azure Compute. So when we talk about compute, we're talking about memory and processor resources. So we're talking about virtual machines. We are technically dealing with both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service when it comes to the Azure cloud. We'll go through both. We'll set up Windows and Linux virtual machines and show you how to connect to them and manage them, but we'll also set up application services and app service plans and Kubernetes for microservices capabilities. And then finally, we'll go through Azure Backup and Monitoring, because we need to make sure that not only are these elements of our organization put into a highly available scenario, but we also need to think about disaster recovery, how to get them back if we lose them, and then how to monitor them to ensure that we're getting the most bang for our buck in the pay-as-you-go Azure model. So that's the rundown, the AZ-104 class. Again, my name is Patrick Lohner. It's my pleasure to be your instructor on this course. Let's get started. We're going to be looking at identity management solutions in Azure, which is namely Azure AD, or Azure Active Directory. Now, Active Directory is a term that most of us familiar with because it's been the domain software, or the domain service, I should say, for Windows networks since Windows 2000. Most of us are familiar with general networking and joining a machine to the domain, and that domain is housed on domain controllers. And so we hear a term like AD, and we automatically, instinctively think of that. Again, at least most of us. And Azure AD is functioning as that identity management solution for the cloud, for Azure subscriptions, as well as for Microsoft 365 subscriptions. But there are going to be some differences. And so in the first section, or first topic, we'll talk about an introduction to Azure AD, what it is and what it is not, and compare and contrast it with Active Directory domain services. Then we'll look at managing users and groups, so creating users that can consume Azure services or M365 services, creating groups to better manage permissions, the different tools that we have for that. That leads us into Azure AD management. We will have already glanced, of course, at the various tools, but we'll go a little bit more in depth on the Azure AD PowerShell and other options, the Azure AD portal that you have for managing users and groups. And then finally, we'll look at working with Azure policies. Azure policies are going to give us the ability to enforce some level of governance and compliance by adding in information like metadata to our resources, by controlling the location of resources, and that could be for security reasons or cost reasons. So a number of different things that we can do from an administrative perspective with Azure policies. We'll also be dealing with the role-based access control, which is how you assign permissions in Azure AD. We'll just start with an introduction to Azure AD, as I said, what it is and what it is not. So what is Azure Active Directory, or AAD, although I've never actually heard somebody call it that for short? It is the identity management solution for the Microsoft public cloud. So that's going to include Azure, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Dynamics, and others. And sometimes when you're using Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Dynamics, like for CRM online, you don't actually even realize that you're already using Azure AD. Well, that's basically anytime a tenant is created, every subscription that you have through these Microsoft services, they all create an Azure AD tenant. Okay? And whenever you want, you can start using that tenant to manage access to other applications that Azure AD integrates with, and use it to manage access to your actual Azure subscription as well. All right, so just keep that in mind. Subscribing to any free services with Microsoft and using a Microsoft account, a work account, will create that tenant. There are a lot of features and benefits to this that we can go through, but just from the start, I mean, essentially, this is identity management, right? And so that means it is a database. The database contains users and groups. The users and groups are the users are authenticated when they attempt to sign in against this Azure AD instance. Once authenticated, they are then potentially authorized to access resources, and those resources can be inside the Microsoft cloud, but they could also be, other SaaS applications like Salesforce, Dropbox, Concur, M-Files, and many, many others. Some features and benefits: it is multi-tenant, so you do have a unique instance that is dedicated to your particular company, but it is hosted in the larger cloud. It does provide single sign-on to any cloud or on-premise web app. There are thousands of SaaS applications, as we've mentioned, that Azure AD can integrate with very easily. It does protect sensitive data and applications, so you can enforce application security with unique identity protection capabilities. We've got reports for suspicious sign-ins. We've got scanning for potential vulnerabilities. Through the Secure Score, you've got advanced security reports. We've got notifications, personalized remediation recommendations, those kinds of things. You can use this to protect on-premise web applications with secure remote access. Adding to that potentially multi-factor authentication, adding conditional access policies, which would allow you to control maybe regions that people were coming from or other characteristics of the connection. And so, you can have people accessing this portal and accessing different applications, and some of them are on-prem and some of them are in the cloud, but they access them all from the same place. And we can add those additional features to better secure that. It's cross-platform support, so iOS, Android, Windows devices, and even Mac OS X. We can easily extend your local on-premises Active Directory to the cloud. Not every organization will do that, but through the use of Azure AD Connect, which is something that we will discuss a little bit later, it makes it easy to populate Azure AD with existing user accounts from an on-prem AD. Now, that's not the same thing as having a domain controller in the cloud. This is a separate database, if you want to call it that. We call it an instance of Azure AD that stores these users and groups. The question is just, how do the users and groups get populated? And so they can be populated from the internal directory that, the vast majority of organizations are using. So we need an identity management program because we have to be able to determine who's authorized to use our stuff, who's authorized to use my applications, who's authorized to use my third-party applications that we integrate with. And so that's what Azure AD is doing for us. Now let's talk about some terminology just to make sure everybody's on the same page when we use some of these terms. Identity is actually not a term that typically gets used, but clearly is at the heart of every identity management solution. It just refers to somebody who can be authenticated, and so otherwise known as accounts, right? Typically, we're talking about a user account that has an associated password. Those are the credentials that we use to authenticate. Now, it could be apps or services. With apps and services, you can have service accounts that also have a password, but other times we can have certificates or secret keys that are used to identify those accounts. All right, but even in Active Directory, I mean, we don't typically call them that. We call them user principals or user accounts, but they are an actual identity. What is if you know Active Directory, what is the term that's used? The term that's used to describe every object, every security principle is what they like to call it in the directory, is an SID, security identifier. Okay, and so it is an actual identity. That's what we're doing. So anyway, Azure AD account or an account is really just an identity that has data associated with it. So you can't have an account without that identity. An Azure AD account is an identity created through Azure AD or through the Microsoft 365 portal, and they're stored in your tenant's instance. All right, so it's specific to you. Azure subscriptions are used to pay for Azure cloud services. You can have as many subscriptions as you want. They can be linked through a provider like a cloud solutions provider, CSP, or they can be linked to a credit card. It's a pay-as-you-go kind of thing through the individual, but you have to have a subscription, and we'll talk about all of that. Your Azure AD identities can give access to one or more subscriptions. And then you have the tenant or the directory. I usually call it a tenant. That's the kind of the cloud terminology. It's a dedicated and trusted instance of Azure AD. It's automatically created when you sign up for a subscription, and it represents your organization. You could technically refer to it as a domain, but that would be using on-premises terminology, but often I will do that just to kind of help people to understand, okay, what you're talking about is a security boundary. It's your individual tenant. It's your Azure AD. Even though it's a multi-tenant environment, nobody else's information is going to be stored there. Now, we can federate and things with other people, but, typically, but nothing else is actually going to be stored in your individual tenant. In this demonstration, we're going to look at the Azure AD portal. This is just a brief kind of introduction. We'll get into a lot of the management tools and permissions, of course, once we keep going. But when you go to aad.portal.azure.com, you get the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. Now, just as a clarification, I can also go to portal.office.com. And in portal.office.com, assuming that I am a global admin, I will be presented with any apps that, if I have licenses, any apps that I have access to, and then the Admin Center. That seems to be taking a bit. But the two are going to be, they're going to be different. Now, you can get to the Azure AD Admin Center from the M365 Admin Center, or you can just go directly there. Okay, so if I scroll down or I just view all the tiles and I've got admin, then this is the M365 Admin Center. Now, here's where we need a little bit of clarification, because if I go and select users, active users, what I'm actually going to be seeing is users that exist where? Users that exist in Azure AD. So you can create a user here, you can modify users here, and they are going to reside in Azure AD. So it's just a different portal. You can also hit Show All, and then there's a link to the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. We're going to stay out of here predominantly just because it's not an Office 365 course, but I just want to note that you can do that. So the default is your is a dashboard. The dashboard can be edited. You can move things around. You can add and delete. So notice here, there's a bunch of different things that we can add in. So if we wanted to say add a quick link to the Azure portal, just go ahead and do that. So you can drag and drop and move these around. Oh, I didn't realize it was already there. Oops. Move those around and construct this the way that you want. Okay, so just put your relevant information up there. This is just kind of an intro. That's not really necessary. There'd be a quick access to users and groups, maybe user sign-in information. So you can develop these dashboards the way that you see fit. Oops, there we go. And then when you're done, you can either hit preview or hit save. And if you go save, it'll just take you back here. Technically, you can create additional dashboards. You can completely customize this. And this just has quick links to adding users, adding groups, looking at, Azure AD, here, looking at Azure AD Connect and seeing, okay, are we actually synchronized? Yes, it's enabled, when the last sync was, password hash, other kinds of things. So some people like to stay on the dashboards. Usually I'm just going down and clicking Azure AD. That is going to give you the view of your tenant. Okay, so you can see my tenant. My role is global administrator. This is my license. Here's my tenant ID. And then this is just our demo. This is just our demo domain. So you can then select users, and you would see the same list of users that we saw before. It'll tell you whether they're directory synced or not, what their username is. You can also create new users here, and you have bulk, create, delete, invite options as well. In any of these administrative portals, just kind of keep an eye on this kind of stuff. So all users is there, password reset. This would be where we would go to turn on self-service password reset. But notice once I'm in there now, this all changes. Okay, now I'm within password reset properties. And so I can go through and modify and access. You've also got this breadcrumb type of navigation that was introduced first, I think way back in Windows Vista. And so we can kind of back up that way. So password reset, user settings, activity, which be user sign-ins over the last 7 days. We've got filters and whatnot. This should be all me, I would think. Yeah, for the most part, this is going to be me, just our demo environments, audit logs, so looking for particular things that have happened. So for instance, here is, this update, a user was updated. It was updated through the Azure graph, so it was an agent. What was the target? Well, my account was the target. What were the modified properties? Those were the modified properties. It looks like I just added myself to a group or something. Okay. So anyway, that's the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. As I said, we're going to come back into this many more times. If we go back to the main area, I suppose, we've got external identities. We've got role-based access control. We'll be talking about that later. We've got Azure AD Connect, licenses, MDM settings, properties, security is where we would get our conditional access, our secure score capabilities. So, everything's available through there. It's not my intent, of course, with this demo to go through absolutely every little thing, because some of these things we haven't really even talked about yet. But we'll get there as we proceed.